I had been with NexVent since the days when the whole company fit inside a damp little garage on the outskirts of Seattle. 20 years in tech had taught me to expect constant change, new faces, shifting management styles, and restructurings that made everyone hold their breath. But that morning, when I heard the sharp click of high heels echoing down the hallway and saw the entire executive team following a young woman I had never seen before, something unfamiliar crept up my spine. Not curiosity, a warning. Aubrey Hartman walked into the conference room with the confidence of someone stepping off the cover of a business magazine. Her hair was pulled back, her suit sharply tailored, and she carried herself like attention was her default setting. What froze me wasn't her presence, but the way the people behind her looked at her. There was something almost reverent in their posture, as if she held the key to something far more important than whatever title appeared in the introduction email. Our CEO spoke with a level of enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. He introduced Aubrey as our new director of strategy, appointed directly by Eastbridge Capital, the investment fund that had poured money into NexVent 3 months earlier. He talked about fresh vision, bold direction, and the need for fearless young leaders, the same industry cliches I had heard for decades. Then he said the next part. Lana Mercer, who looked directly at me, will oversee the foundation systems. From this point on, she reports to Aubrey. The room went so silent that I could hear the projector humming. No one looked my way. No one reacted. They were simply waiting to see what I would do. And I did nothing. I smiled and nodded, pretending this was nothing more than a harmless adjustment on the org chart. Staying calm was the only way to keep myself still and out of the rumor mill. After the meeting, as everyone drifted away, I walked back to my office. I was not attached to the room because it was comfortable. I was attached because every corner held a piece of the years we spent clawing our way toward survival. But I didn't even have time to set my bag down before Aubrey appeared in the doorway. Her voice was smooth but completely devoid of consideration. I will be using this office, Lana. Logistics has been informed. Please relocate to the East Wing before the end of the day. No explanation, no apology, not even the courtesy usually offered to someone who had given 2 decades of their life to a place. I simply replied, "All right." When I stepped out, 2 logistics employees were already waiting, their eyes apologetic but their orders clear. They packed pieces of my history into uniform boxes without knowing they were moving part of NexVent's origin story into a forgotten corner. My new office sat beside the intern row, with an old wooden desk, a wobbly chair, and a computer so slow I could brew coffee before it finished booting up. I looked around, and what I felt wasn't bitterness. It felt scripted. Too fast, too precise to be a coincidence. About an hour later, Eli Thompson showed up. Eli was someone I had trusted. We had weathered enough crises together that seeing him brought a moment of comfort, but he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I heard Aubrey might merge your team with growth engineering. Just a rumor, but people are talking. I asked whether he knew anything before the announcement. Eli glanced away. Just whispers, Lana. Nothing certain. I understood. He was distancing himself, waiting to see which side would win. I had seen that survival instinct more times than I could count in this industry. It still stung. That afternoon, I went back to the engineering floor. The moment I walked in, the energy shifted. A few whispers, then silence. Several people were gathered around the large screen, but no one invited me over. No one even looked at me for more than a breath. These were people who once told me they would follow me into any project. Now they acted like I wasn't even there. When I sat down, I tried accessing the NextCore project folder, the platform I had built over 8 years. Access denied. Restricted due to new security protocols. I tried again. Same result. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the screen. I wasn't angry. I simply saw the pattern. This was the next step in a sequence already set in motion. Aubrey hadn't arrived to complement leadership. She had arrived to replace part of it, and that part was me. I sat still for several minutes. I could have walked to the CEO's office. I could have sent a demand for clarification. But I didn't. Because of my instincts, the same instincts that had saved this company more times than anyone knew, were telling me something deeper, Something more calculated was unfolding beneath the surface. That evening, as I crossed the parking lot, I looked back at the NexVent building. I had poured the best years of my life into it, but for the first time, I felt like I was standing outside a story I should have understood better than anyone. And that made one thing certain: I was going to uncover the truth behind Aubrey's arrival, and I was going to find out why the first thing she did was erase me from the company I helped build. The next morning, the moment I stepped into the office, I could feel the shift in the air. Everything moved quietly than usual, as if the entire floor had grown a new layer of caution overnight. I hadn't spoken to anyone yet, but the way a few coworkers glanced at me told me everything. Not hostility, wariness, exactly the atmosphere Aubrey wanted. I walked straight to my new desk. Most of the desks nearby were empty, and the only sounds were the occasional scrape of a chair from the far west corner. My computer booted up sluggishly, like an old piece of equipment pushed into a dark corner to wait for disposal. I watched the loading screen, steadying myself, but there was no denying the sense of being pushed to the margins on purpose. As soon as I logged in, I received an email from Aubrey. She announced a strategic meeting with all the team leads at 10 in the morning. She didn't mention me or acknowledge my role, even though I had led every meeting of that kind for years. I pulled up the attendee list. My name wasn't there. No note, no explanation. I had been removed from the strategic table quietly, but with surgical precision. I opened the platform project folder. Several documents I had prepared the previous week had been altered. I switched to comparison mode. Numbers changed, charts distorted, key recommendations removed. On the surface, the file looked only slightly disjointed, but if presented to the board, it would paint me as someone losing control and lacking accuracy. Each tiny alteration carried a clear intention: undermine credibility without leaving a trace. Around 9, I ran into Bella in the kitchen. She smiled, but her eyes were full of hesitation. I lightly asked about her private meeting with Aubrey. Bella stayed silent for a long moment before whispering that Aubrey was crafting a new vision and trying to prove the old guard was slowing innovation. Her voice dropped further as she mentioned that Aubrey had shown a European analysis packet that looked almost identical to the proposal I wrote half a year ago. She said she wasn't sure. I was, down to every line. When the 10 o'clock meeting ended, the people who walked out gave me unfamiliar looks. A few avoided eye contact altogether. I knew they had heard a story about me. A story Aubrey had carefully planted, one that painted me as outdated, resistant, a barrier to long-term strategy. Early in the afternoon, I received a message from Eli. His wording was cautious, stripped of all emotion. Aubrey wants to meet you at 3 in the conference room on floor 7. Even in a message, no one wanted a trail connecting back to me. Before the meeting, I checked the system's version history. The edits were done using an admin-level account. Aubrey couldn't have gained that access within a few weeks. Someone was helping her, possibly from engineering, or someone tempted by promises of promotions, influence, or favors. I opened an older backup in my personal archive. Every number matched, logical, and complete, which only made the tampered version more obvious in its intention. At 3, I walked into the room. Aubrey was already seated, leaning back comfortably, as if the room were a stage and she was the featured act. She let me stand for several seconds on purpose before glancing up. Her voice was soft, but dripping with arrogance. She began with a speech about the need for innovation, then transitioned to the issue of certain recent documents lacking clarity. She projected the altered file onto the screen. That alone told me exactly what she wanted: for me to accept the fault so she could justify downgrading my role. I told her plainly that the file shown was not the version I submitted. Aubrey didn't look surprised. She simply said that documents were sometimes refined to align with higher level strategy, a delicate admission that she had tampered with the files, or at least approved the act. After a few minutes, she revealed her real goal. She wanted full control over the entire platform project within 2 weeks and asked me to perform a soft handoff, as if the project had only ever been temporarily mine. When I stepped out of the room, Eli was standing in the hallway. He looked at me for a split second before shifting his gaze elsewhere. He said something vague about how the company was going through changes and everyone needed to prepare. It wasn't advice, it was a warning that I no longer had allies. At my desk, an email from HR appeared. They informed me I would undergo a role reevaluation written in neutral corporate language. But anyone who'd spent time in this industry knew what that meant. It was the first step in phasing out senior staff. I sat staring at the screen for a while, not because I was shocked, but because I understood now that Aubrey didn't just want to replace me. She wanted to twist the entire project's history and turn me into the obstacle she needed to justify her rise. But she miscalculated one thing. I'm not the kind of person who lets myself get erased. If Aubrey wanted to build her narrative, I needed to rebuild the original picture, complete, documented, and undeniable. And everything that happened today only made one thing clear. It was time to follow the trail and uncover what Aubrey was hiding. I opened the project archives from 3 years ago and began tracing every data fluctuation that only I would recognize. Others might be fooled by a few edited reports. I wouldn't. I had built the foundation of this entire system, and anyone trying to rearrange the pieces would always leave marks. In the days that followed, I tried to keep my routine at the office as normal as possible, but nothing around me felt familiar anymore. Every morning, I walked into NexVent feeling like I was moving through a thin layer of tension, the kind that could tear with the slightest push. No one said anything outright, but the avoided eye contact, the conversations that stopped the moment I walked by, all pointed to the same truth. Aubrey had already planted her first seeds of suspicion. I spent most of my hours at the desk, opening old reports and comparing them with the current versions. The changes were everywhere, not just in my market analysis. A few charts in the product report had been rounded into numbers that no longer made sense. Financial assessments were edited just enough to shift their meaning. Even an HR summary had been updated to paint my team as struggling to adapt. Each change was tiny, subtle enough to slip past anyone not checking closely. But side by side, a pattern emerged clearly. The reports were slowly being aligned to justify the overly aggressive expansion strategy Aubrey was pushing. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone who could verify system access logs, and I knew exactly who that would be. Cassian from Data Security. He lived by the rulebook, treated integrity like a compass. He wasn't someone easily swayed or drawn into office factions. If I gave him real evidence, he wouldn't ignore it. I found him in the secondary server room at the end of the day, reviewing routine access logs. I waited until he looked up. I told him I needed help investigating irregularities in several reports and suspected someone had altered data outside the proper workflow. Cassian didn't care much at first, not until I handed him a consolidated list showing timing overlaps across multiple system branches. After only a few lines, his expression shifted. He didn't say much, just nodded and said he would look deeper. That night, as I gathered my things to leave, Cassian appeared at the door. He didn't step inside, he just leaned against the frame, as if weighing whether he should share what he had learned. Eventually, he spoke. The access requests did not come from any internal company device. I asked him to repeat that. Cassian explained that the logins used high-level technician credentials, but they originated from a device not registered in NexVent's hardware database. That meant someone outside the company accessed the system remotely, using stolen or willingly provided credentials. When I asked if he could trace the source, Cassian said only that the origin belonged to a strategic consulting office. And when he said the company's name, a cold shiver ran down my spine. It was a firm Aubrey had worked with closely at her previous job. I left the office that evening with my mind spinning. My suspicions were falling into place piece by piece. Aubrey wasn't just trying to take my project or my role. Everything she was doing pointed to a major shift in strategy, one that senior leadership would be guided into by manipulated data. A fabricated expansion trend that, if executed, could push NexVent into dangerous instability. Aubrey wasn't creating errors. She was manufacturing momentum. The next morning, Cassian sent me a preliminary report. I read every line in silence. The unauthorized logins had begun days before Aubrey officially joined the company, meaning she had prepared her move in advance, and not alone. Someone outside, maybe an entire team, was helping her. I knew I needed confirmation from someone with real authority inside the company. So I went to see Eleanor, our chief operating officer. She wasn't someone who enjoyed games or schemes. If she sensed something wrong, she would never sit quietly. When I stepped into her office, Eleanor stared at me for a long moment before saying, "I look like someone standing in the middle of a storm no one wanted to admit was real." I placed Cassian's report on her desk. Eleanor read it slowly, not missing a single detail. When she finished, she leaned back and crossed her arms. She asked if I was certain I wanted to pursue this. I told her I couldn't look away. Eleanor didn't say she would help, but she said something far more important. She would verify everything with her own resources. And if what I brought to her was true, she wouldn't allow anyone to sabotage the company she had built from its first bricks. That evening, a message arrived from an unknown number. Only one sentence. "Stop while you still can." The message erased itself the moment I finished reading. No clue about the sender, but the intent was unmistakable. Aubrey knew I was digging. She wasn't hiding behind subtle tactics anymore. This was a direct warning. I sat with the phone in my hand for several minutes. I wasn't afraid. What I felt was the weight of understanding that this had gone far beyond a fight for a job title. Aubrey was executing something systematic, and my removal was only step one. If I stopped now, everything would unfold unseen. I opened my laptop again and spread the documents across a timeline. I traced intersections between data edits, Aubrey's private meetings, and the people she had been meeting outside the company. Every page I examined only strengthened my suspicion that I was looking at a sabotage plan so carefully constructed that if not caught early, it would infect the entire company. From that moment on, I understood I was no longer facing a personal conflict. I was standing in front of a conspiracy, and I had to follow it to the end. The weekend arrived, but it didn't bring the usual sense of rest. I woke early, my mind still spinning with the scattered pieces I was trying to assemble. I spent the entire morning writing out the full chain of events, from the moment Aubrey walked into NexVent to the strange data alterations that followed. When I looked at the summary, the larger picture finally came into focus. What once felt like suspicion now felt certain. This was bigger than a fight for a position. I needed stronger proof. What Cassian found confirmed the system breach, but it wasn't enough to tie it directly to Aubrey. I had to uncover the link between those unauthorized accesses and the direction Aubrey was trying to force on the company. I started with her schedule, not the official one, but the whispers collected from coworkers. I asked carefully, never pushing too hard, never implying anyone was taking sides. A few people mentioned Aubrey had met with two outsiders during her first week. One of them worked at the consulting firm Cassian had traced. No one knew what those meetings were for. They weren't reported, weren't documented, which meant they had nothing to do with official processes. I reopened the older market analyses I had created. A stock projection from the previous year caught my eye. The chart showed that if NexVent expanded into Europe too fast, the stock would swing sharply. And if someone manipulated the data to push leadership toward that risky move and knew the exact timing of its announcement, the financial gain could be significant. The thought made me pause. Aubrey might not just be climbing the ladder. She might be serving the interests of an outside group for profit. That evening, Eleanor called me. Her voice sounded hoarse, like she had carried the weight of a long day. She said she had reviewed the data Cassian sent. She admitted the unauthorized entries couldn't be dismissed as technical errors. Some appeared late at night, at hours when only top clearance individuals could be in the office. Eleanor asked if I believed someone inside was helping Aubrey. I didn't have concrete proof, but every sign pointed in that direction. Eleanor decided to review the entire data chain from the beginning of the month. She didn't promise to take my side, but she said something more valuable. If someone were undermining NexVent from within, she wouldn't let it stand. The next morning, as soon as I arrived, I noticed my computer booted faster than usual. I opened the system logs and found access entries from the previous night. Someone had been in my machine while I was gone. I locked down every working document and moved copies into my personal archive. I had never needed to do that in all my years at NexVent. At lunch, Bella found me in the cafeteria. She looked tense. She said Aubrey had called her the night before, asking pointed questions about my work habits, but the questions were framed to highlight flaws. Bella cut the call short, because it felt wrong. That alone told me Aubrey was testing the people around me, looking for someone she could sway. Early in the afternoon, I received an email from legal scheduling a meeting for the next morning. No reason, no attachments. Just a time and a room. That wasn't NexVent's standard procedure. It meant one of two things. They wanted to warn me, or they were preparing to push me out. That night, I called Cassian. I asked if he could pull the entry logs for the conference room on floor 10, the one Aubrey liked to use after hours. Cassian said he could, but he would need to be discreet. Before hanging up, he asked if I felt unsafe. I told him I had things under control, though I knew he didn't believe me. The next morning, I arrived at NexVent an hour early. I needed to check the conference room before meeting with legal. The access history showed Aubrey had used that room multiple times after 6 in the evening over the past 2 weeks. There were additional entries with no name, only top-level clearance markers. That wasn't normal. I stared at the display panel, knowing I had just stepped onto something Aubrey wanted hidden. When I turned around, Aubrey was in the hallway. She looked straight at me, her polite smile stretched thin over a colder truth. She asked why I was in so early. I told her I was checking the room for the meeting later. Aubrey nodded, but the smile slipped. She said she hoped I was well prepared for my meeting with legal. That wasn't encouragement, it was a warning. The meeting began at 9. 3 people from legal were already waiting. A thick folder sat on the table, one they didn't let me see. They asked a series of questions about my business analyses, my cross-team coordination, and whether I struggled to adapt to new workflows. Their intent was obvious. They wanted me to declare myself unfit for my role. I stayed calm and said the only thing I could say. I always follow protocol, and what I need is data that hasn't been altered outside authorized channels. The room went quiet. One of them asked if I had proof. I said I would provide it soon and requested that legal conduct an independent audit of the data changes from the past 3 weeks. When I stepped out, Aubrey was waiting right outside. She tilted her head and said she hoped I would soon find a position better suited to me. I looked directly at her. This was no longer a hidden conflict. This was war. When I returned to my desk, a message from Cassian was already waiting. He had found something important, and he said I needed to see it immediately. I opened Cassian's message the moment I returned to my desk. He had written only one sentence, but it was enough to make my pulse jump. He had found what he called a mirror link. I knew exactly what that meant. In data analysis, a mirror link is an abnormal overlap between two unrelated information streams. When a system access pattern lines up perfectly with the timing of a strategic change, the odds of coincidence are close to zero. I rushed down to the tech floor. Cassian sat in front of 3 large monitors, dark circles under his eyes. He pointed to a data table and said he had cross-checked the market analysis access logs with the timestamps of Aubrey's internal submissions. Every time she filed a new strategic proposal, there was unauthorized access to my original data roughly 30 minutes before. What stopped me cold was the access identity. The logs showed a top-tier clearance level, a type of access reserved only for the executive committee. Cassian said no one else held that permission. If someone was helping Aubrey, it wasn't an ordinary employee. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't personal. This was high-level manipulation. Cassian handed me another record. It tracked data packets being transferred out of NexVent's internal network to an external server overseas. The first packet had been sent on the very day Aubrey joined the company. The latest one was sent 2 days ago, and each one corresponded to strategic documents I had created. I asked if he could trace the server. He said he was trying, but it was risky. If whoever was behind it detected an unusual query, they could wipe every trace. I told him to move slowly, quietly. Cassian nodded, but worry flickered in his eyes. When I returned to the main office, Aubrey was speaking with 3 managers in a small glass-walled room nearby. The door did nothing to soften her voice. She was saying that some people refused to embrace change and were obstructing the company's growth. One of the managers nodded, though uneasily. I knew they were talking about me. I walked past without a word. Aubrey looked at me for a fraction of a second, her eyes flashing with challenge. She assumed I was cornered. But I was no longer the woman who stayed silent 3 weeks ago. All afternoon, I felt watched. Not overtly, but through glances quickly averted, small whispers that died the moment I stepped into a room. Something invisible was forming around me. I didn't know what Aubrey had told them, but she was trying to paint me as resistant, outdated, and misaligned with her direction. The more she pushed that narrative, the clearer it was that she felt threatened. After work, I stopped by Eleanor's office. She was reviewing recent financial reports. When she saw me, she gestured for me to sit. I told her everything Cashin had discovered. She listened closely, never interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. She said what I had was enough to raise serious suspicion, but not enough for formal accusations. She warned me to expect stronger retaliation. People with something to gain would not let me expose them easily. I asked if she had ever doubted Aubrey. Eleanor said Aubrey was too fast in seizing control, too quick in pushing out anyone who didn't align with her. She had never seen someone reshape an entire division within weeks, but she reminded me that if I wanted to fight Aubrey, I had to stay patient. No sudden moves. As I stood to leave, she added something I held on to. Smart people don't win by reacting quickly. They win by seeing further. I understood. I didn't just need to defend myself, I needed a full strategy to expose everything. That night, I received an email from an anonymous address. The subject line was a warning, and the message only said one thing: do not trust anyone. I had no idea who sent it or what exactly they meant. But someone else out there knew what was happening. I spent hours at my computer reviewing every document, every backup, every trace Aubrey had left. I created a new master file, listing every suspicious event in exact chronological order. I knew this would become the first part of the dossier I intended to present, the one she wouldn't be able to argue away. Near midnight, Cassian called. He said he had traced the outbound data packets. The destination server belonged to a consulting firm that Aubrey once worked with. Not only that, the trail linked to an investment fund that had quietly purchased NexVent shares over the past year. Hearing that, my entire body went still. This was no longer a suspicion. This was collusion. Cassian said he would send me all the evidence, but I had to be extremely careful. If the people behind this sensed we were closing in, they could strike back fast. I promised to protect his identity when the time came. After the call ended, I sat in silence. For the first time, I fully grasped the scale of what I was facing. But I also knew that if I stepped back now, Aubrey would keep going, and NexVent would fall into the hands of people who saw it only as a tool for profit. I saved everything to an external drive and locked it inside a small safe at home. Then I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself for a long time. I once thought I was fighting someone trying to steal credit, but now I understand. The enemy wasn't one person, it was a network, and I knew I had to see this through to the end. The next morning, the moment I stepped into NexVent, I felt the shift in the air. Eyes that once held familiarity now carried caution. A few people talking fell silent as I passed. That silence wasn't accidental. It echoed the early days of Aubrey's arrival, except this time the target was me. Aubrey stood near the main hallway, speaking with a mid-level manager. She spoke just loudly enough for me to hear. She said the company was trying to maintain stability and hoped everyone would avoid creating more disruption. The word disruption was emphasized with precision. The manager glanced at me, forced a tight smile, and looked away. I didn't respond. Aubrey wanted to see if I would flinch. At noon, Eleanor called me to her office. She closed the door the moment I entered. She said someone on the board had heard I was refusing to cooperate with the new direction. The phrasing matched exactly what Aubrey had once used about me in a meeting. I wasn't surprised. Aubrey didn't just want me out of the division. She wanted me stripped of influence. Eleanor asked if I was certain about the data Cassian found. I confirmed everything was from system logs, impossible to fabricate. She nodded but couldn't hide her worry. She told me to stay extremely calm, avoid confronting Aubrey directly, and focus on tightening my evidence. She said the right moment would come, and when it did, I needed to strike with precision. Leaving her office, I ran into Howie in the hallway. He stood there like he had been waiting. He spoke quietly, saying he wanted to meet later that evening at the coffee shop near the parking lot, away from curious eyes. I nodded without asking questions. I understood he didn't want to be caught in the swirl of rumors Aubrey was manufacturing. The afternoon moved in silence. I tried to focus, but Cassian's findings kept circling my mind like a puzzle piece not yet placed. Around 4, I received an email from legal requesting all strategic analyses from the past 2 years. They didn't need that volume of material unless they were trying to dissect my work for weaknesses. Aubrey was accelerating. After work, I met Howie at the coffee shop. He sat in a quiet corner, looking tense. He said Aubrey had held a closed-door meeting with several people on strategy. In that meeting, she called me an obstacle to progress and said she was preparing to send an evaluation report on my performance to the board. What shook me was what came next. Howie said Aubrey had hinted that I might have access to data without authorization with the help of someone in the tech department. She was trying to twist Cassian's assistance into evidence that I had violated security protocol. If she succeeded, even if I was innocent, my position would be endangered. Howie slid a small stack of printed notes toward me. It was a transcript of a conversation he overheard. In it, Aubrey spoke with someone on the analytics team about crafting negative comments for my performance review. The language was wrapped in polite phrasing, but the intent was unmistakable. I thanked Howie for risking so much. He said he did it because he knew I wasn't resisting change, only trying to keep work done the right way. Looking at him, I realized not everyone at NexVent had been pulled into Aubrey's orbit. That night, once I was home, a message arrived from the same anonymous number as before. This one was longer. The sender said a member of the board had ties to the investment fund Cassian traced. The message warned that someone wanted me out before I could present my evidence. I read it repeatedly, but couldn't identify who sent it. It fit everything I had been feeling. I wasn't just stepping on Aubrey's plans. I was brushing against an entire network. I spent the evening reorganizing all my files. I sorted them by timeline, noting every connection between unauthorized access attempts and Aubrey's decisions. Then I created a complete backup and sent it to a personal attorney who had helped me years ago. I only told him to hold it and open it if he didn't hear from me for several days. Near midnight, Cassian called. He had detected a new access attempt that afternoon while I was meeting with Howie. Someone tried to open my files from the main server. Cassian blocked it, but it meant Aubrey, or whoever backed her, was becoming desperate to see what I had. When the call ended, I sat in my living room for a long time, not out of fear, but out of understanding. This wasn't a departmental conflict anymore. I had stepped into something much larger, but I also knew I couldn't turn back, not when the truth was this close. Tomorrow, I will have to begin the next step. The next morning, I arrived at NexVent earlier than usual. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the building and feeling an invisible tension waiting for me inside. There would be a major meeting with the executive board today, and I knew everything would shift afterward, no matter the direction. I took a deep breath and walked into the lobby. The atmosphere was different. Conversations stopped as I passed. A few people glanced at me and quickly looked away. Clearly, a new rumor had spread, and I had no doubt Aubrey was behind it. She wanted to stack the room against me before the meeting even began. As I walked through the open workspace, I saw Aubrey speaking with two mid-level managers. She talked about the importance of maintaining stability and hoping no one would create additional disruption. She emphasized the word disruption with surgical precision. When she saw me, she paused for a heartbeat and offered a calm smile. It was the smile of someone who believed she had already won. I didn't respond. Silence often unsettled people like her more than confrontation. I spent the entire morning reviewing my materials, reorganizing my arguments. Every access log, every altered timestamp, and every data inconsistency was clearly marked. I reviewed everything multiple times. In a meeting like the one ahead, every detail mattered. Around 10, Cassian called me to the tech floor. When I arrived, he stood beside the system dashboard looking alarmed. He said someone had just attempted to access my files minutes earlier. The encryption he set had blocked it, but it meant someone was actively trying to see what I was preparing. I asked if he could identify who it was. Cassian said the attempt used the highest level clearance, the kind only executive members possessed. It confirmed my suspicion. Aubrey was not acting alone. Someone with real power was backing her. After thanking Cassian, I walked back toward the main office. On the way, I ran into Howie, who looked troubled. He said he overheard that Aubrey and a few managers were finalizing a negative performance report about me, and they might submit it before our meeting. If they filed first, the board could be influenced by Aubrey's narrative. I told Howie I was ready and had no intention of stepping back. After lunch, I returned and saw Aubrey's walking with two board members toward the elevators. She looked confident, almost triumphant. She glanced at me briefly, her eyes full of arrogance. She likely believed her report was enough to weaken me. I continued preparing my documents. I printed 3 full sets, one for the board, one for Eleanor, and one to keep with me. I wasn't about to risk anyone altering my evidence before I presented it. Around 2, a reminder email for the meeting arrived. My heartbeat picked up despite my preparation. I was about to face people far more powerful than Aubrey. I entered the conference room 10 minutes early. Eleanor was already there, reviewing papers. When she saw me, she gave a small nod, quiet reassurance. Several board members were seated, flipping through their materials. The room was silent except for the soft rustling of pages. Aubrey entered next with 2 attorneys. She sat opposite me, posture sharp, composed, radiating overconfidence. Her hands rested lightly on the table, as if the outcome had already been decided. At exactly 3, Gerald walked in and asked everyone to sit. He opened the meeting by stating they were there to address internal conflicts and unusual patterns within the company's strategic data. He said he wanted everything resolved today to protect the upcoming quarter's plans. Aubrey raised her hand immediately. She spoke about the pressure to innovate and how certain individuals struggled to adapt to the company's new direction. She didn't say my name, but everyone knew who she meant. Then she submitted an urgent performance evaluation. Her attorney passed the documents to Gerald. I stayed calm. When Gerald asked for my response, I placed my thick folder on the table. I stated clearly that the issue wasn't resistance to change. The issue was unauthorized access to strategic data and its transmission outside NexVent. I presented each timeline entry, each log, each sign of deliberate interference. I showed the pattern linking those accesses to Aubrey's submissions. When I displayed the side-by-side comparison of original data versus the altered versions, the room fell silent. A few board members straightened in their chairs. One of them frowned as they saw the outbound data packets sent to the consulting firm that Aubrey once worked with. I didn't accuse anyone. I let the evidence speak. Aubrey began to unravel. She objected, insisting my evidence was invalid or tampered with. One of her attorneys demanded a pause to verify the legality of my documents, but Gerald refused. He looked at Eleanor, then at me, then said in a firm, measured voice, "These findings warrant an independent investigation." Aubrey turned to him, stunned. This was not the reaction she expected, and that was the first moment I watched her lose control. When Cassian finished presenting the full access map, the room fell into a tense, suffocating silence. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Gerald looked around the table, his expression heavier than I had ever seen. Aubrey tried to maintain her composure, but her fingers tightened around her documents until the edges curled. Aubrey's attorney spoke first. He said Cassian's data could be misinterpreted. He argued that unusual access patterns didn't prove Aubrey was the one performing them. He suggested her account might have been compromised or manipulated by someone trying to frame her. His tone was confident, but something in his reasoning faltered. It sounded defensive, not convincing. Gerald asked Cassian to present again, this time focusing on the timestamps tied to Aubrey's credentials. Cassian enlarged the chart, pointing out repeated accesses from the same device and the same internal network address in the office. Those entries were difficult to dismiss. Aubrey drew a long breath. She claimed she had delegated her permissions to several people, that someone on her team might have used her access without asking. Her voice wavered, rising and falling. But when Gerald asked for the names of those she had delegated to, she dodged the question, offering vague answers with no specifics. One board member asked why a senior manager would hand out high-level permissions without documented authorization. Aubrey pushed back immediately, saying her team valued flexibility and avoided rigid procedures. A few board members frowned. The explanation didn't land. The tension sharpened when Eleanor proposed temporarily suspending all of Aubrey's strategic access during the investigation. Aubrey's face changed instantly. She protested that the decision would disrupt every growth plan she had built. Eleanor calmly replied that those plans needed verification before continuing. Gerald watched both of them for a moment, then announced the board would deliberate privately for 5 minutes. Everyone stood and stepped out. I remained seated, unwilling to pace or appear unsettled, while the verdict hung in the air. Through the glass wall, I could see small clusters forming. committee members speaking in low voices. Cassian stood alone in a far corner, staring at his phone. Aubrey stepped into the hallway, whispering urgently into hers. She glanced at me once, as if checking whether I could hear her. 10 minutes later, everyone returned. Gerald delivered the decision. Aubrey would have her strategic access restricted until an independent technical audit completed its review. I would not be suspended, contrary to Aubrey's request, but I would need to submit a detailed account of my data collection process to ensure transparency. Aubrey reacted immediately. She said the decision was discriminatory and insisted that if fairness mattered, both sides should be suspended during review. But this time, no one echoed her argument. A few board members even flipped their documents as if eager to end the meeting. When the session adjourned, people filed out without so much as glancing at Aubrey. I stood slowly. I had no desire to gloat. This battle wasn't over. I needed clarity for what came next. Returning to my desk, I found a white envelope placed neatly at the center. No sender. Inside were 3 printed pages of internal conversations, time-stamped messages discussing how Aubrey and a board member planned to accelerate the transfer of strategic data before anyone could question it. Some lines were shockingly clear, enough to show the board member wasn't just assisting Aubrey, but quietly directing her. I read each line carefully. My heartbeat spiked, then steadied. Whoever sent this wanted me to keep going, but I had no idea what their motives were. Verification was essential. I wouldn't walk into a trap. I placed the documents in my case, locked it, and kept my expression neutral. That afternoon, no one mentioned the meeting, but the atmosphere had shifted. A few people looked as though they wanted to speak to me, but hesitated. Some looked at Aubrey with thinly veiled doubt. She kept her office door closed the entire day. When I stepped outside to leave, the Seattle sky hung heavy and gray, rain drifting down like a thin curtain. I paused under the awning for a moment, watching the wet streets and the rush of hurried commuters. What I felt wasn't relief. It wasn't fear either. It was the awareness that I had crossed the first threshold and the path ahead was still long. Aubrey still had allies. The anonymous sender might be a friend or an enemy, and the real fight was only beginning. But I had come too far to back down now. I opened my umbrella and stepped into the thin rain. Every decision from this point forward would require precision, and I understood clearly that the final chapter would not be about data alone. It would be about the truth so many inside this company had spent years trying to bury. The next morning, I arrived at the company with a feeling I couldn't fully name. It wasn't worry, and it wasn't relief either. It was the sense that something would shift today. The Seattle air still held the moisture from last night's rain, and the cold felt like it was keeping unspoken things suspended. As I stepped into the lobby, I saw Gerald speaking with 3 unfamiliar people carrying folders. Cassian moved quickly toward me and spoke quietly. The board had ordered the investigation to expand, and this independent audit team would be reviewing the entire system. That meant every piece of data I had submitted would undergo scrutiny. I nodded. I wasn't afraid of that. What concerned me was whatever still hid behind Aubrey. I caught sight of Aubrey, standing outside Gerald's office. Her face was pale, and she clutched a stack of documents tightly against her chest. When I walked past, she avoided my eyes. Through the cracked door, I heard her voice insisting someone was trying to push her to the edge, but her words didn't carry the same weight anymore. Back at my desk, I opened the anonymous envelope again. The 3 pages of conversation between Aubrey and a board member were untouched. I knew I had to hand them over to the audit team. I couldn't risk becoming the next convenient target because of unverified material. The moment I sent a request for formal verification, Gerald called me to the conference room. When I walked in, nearly every seat was filled. Aubrey sat on the right side of the table. I sat across from her. No one spoke as I took my seat. The meeting began when the lead auditor stood and presented the preliminary findings. He stated clearly that every suspicious system access had come from Aubrey's device. There were no signs of external breaches, no remote control software, no irregular activity from outside sources. Everything pointed directly to her. Aubrey reacted instantly, sharper than before. She insisted someone from her team must have used her account. But the auditor opened another report showing she was the only one with that level of clearance. Her excuses weakened, losing ground with every sentence. When the room quieted again, the auditor produced the next piece of evidence. It was the full version of the conversation transcript between Aubrey and the board member, complete, system captured, and time-stamped by the automatic security log because it contained flagged keywords tied to unauthorized data movement. Aubrey froze. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The auditor read several key lines aloud. The contents made it unmistakably clear. This wasn't a strategy. This was coordination, moving data before the board could ask questions. Gerald turned to Aubrey and asked if she had anything to explain. His tone was steady, but it was no longer an invitation. Aubrey muttered something about misunderstanding, but no one in the room believed her. The auditor concluded that, based on the evidence, he recommended Aubrey's immediate suspension pending further investigation. No one objected. Gerald nodded and called for security. Aubrey shot to her feet, eyes burning red. She turned to me and accused me of destroying her career, demanding to know if I felt proud. I met her gaze and simply told her that no one can destroy you if you haven't destroyed yourself first. She was escorted out, and the door closed behind her with a dull, final thud. Gerald turned to me. He said the board appreciated what I had done, and if I wished, my previous role and full project leadership could be reinstated immediately. I thanked him, but said I didn't want to continue in a place where the truth required such a cost to be seen. Gerald studied me for a long moment before nodding. He understood. Back on the office floor, the tech team was already shutting down Aubrey's access. It was swift, cold, and quiet. No more whispers, no more wary glances. But I knew one thing: the board member who had worked with Aubrey wouldn't be easy to expose. The next phase of the investigation would reveal far more than today had. I packed my things slowly, taking only what mattered. A few colleagues looked at me with gratitude, some with guilt, some with quiet regret. I didn't blame them. Pressure can make good people forget their own compass. Outside, the Seattle sun pushed softly through the gray clouds. The air was cool but gentle, like an ending arriving precisely on time. I slung my bag over my shoulder and walked forward. I felt no triumph and no loss, only the calm of someone who had done what needed to be done and was ready to go where she truly belonged. I didn't look back. I closed this door with every bit of resolve I had, and ahead of me, I knew, there were still things waiting to be uncovered.